So picture this. The United States has just won the Revolutionary War. A huge victory, right? But now comes the really hard part. How do you actually govern this new country? Well, their first shot at it was a system called the Articles of Confederation. But this system, born in the middle of a war, just wasn't built to last. Its collapse, though, was an absolutely crucial step in creating the nation we know today. Okay, let's get into it.
You know, the timing here is everything. The Articles were officially adopted in 1781, while the war was still very much happening. Their main job was to get the 13 states to work together to beat Great Britain. But then, in 1783, the war ends. And suddenly, this government designed for wartime had to figure out how to run a country in peacetime. A totally different ballgame, and one it was not ready for. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why this government was intentionally designed to be weak. Then we'll see how that weakness made it basically impossible for it to function. Next, the economic chaos that followed. Then the one event that was the final straw, Shays Rebellion. And finally, how all of this led to the call for a whole new system.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the mindset behind the Articles. You've got to understand, the number one thing on everyone's mind was fear. I mean, they had just fought a brutal war to get away from a powerful king. The absolute last thing they wanted was to accidentally create their own version of that right here at home. This really gets to the heart of the problem. On one side, you have this deep, real fear of any powerful central government, anything that even smelled like a new monarchy. On the other side, the goal was to make sure that the 13 states kept almost all the power for themselves. This wasn't about creating one unified America yet, it was about creating a loose club of independent states. And the result of that fear? Well, you basically got a nation where each state acted like its own little country. They were all just loosely connected by this very, very weak central government. Think of it less as a nation and more as a firm league of friendship, as they called it. So you design a weak government on purpose. What happens next? Well, you get a system that for all practical purposes just can't function. It was paralyzed, and that paralysis was baked right into the design. I mean, just look at how bare bones this government was. There was only one branch, a Congress. That's it. No president to enforce the laws, no national court system to settle disputes. And get this, every state, whether it was huge like Virginia or tiny like Rhode Island, got exactly one vote. This created constant friction because the needs of a big farming state were completely different from a small shipping state, yet they had the exact same say. And if that wasn't hard enough, look at the rules for actually getting anything done. To pass any important law, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. 9. And if you wanted to change the Articles, you needed all 13. Unanimous agreement. Can you imagine trying to get 13 different states with their own agendas to agree on anything? It was nearly impossible. So the big takeaway here is that this gridlock wasn't some unforeseen bug, it was a feature. The system was designed for inaction. But in the real world, as the country faced huge problems like debt and unrest, its own government was basically stuck in the mud, powerless to do anything about it. Now, this government paralysis, it hit the economy like a ton of bricks. Without a central government that could actually do anything, the nation's finances just spiraled into complete chaos. The government had no money, and it had no control. And here is probably the biggest single flaw of the whole system. The national government could not tax anyone, not a single person. It had no way to raise its own money. All it could do was figure out how much it needed and then go hat in hand to each of the states and basically say, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And as you can probably guess, the states often just said no. They had their own problems, their own bills to pay. I mean, look at this. The government is asking for a certain amount of money to run the country. And what it's actually getting is, well, a tiny fraction of that. You just can't run a country when you're flat broke. The fallout from this was a total mess. The government couldn't pay its own soldiers or the countries that had loaned it money during the war. Each state was printing its own currency, which was just confusing. And worse, states were putting tariffs on each other's goods. Imagine New York charging a tax on firewood from Connecticut. It was economic civil war, and it was choking the life out of the new economy. This really says it all, doesn't it? The United States wasn't one economy. It was 13 little economies, all competing and sometimes actively working against each other. How could you ever build a strong nation like that? So, the country is in a political and economic nosedive.
All it needed was one big event to expose just how broken the system really was. And that event, that final spark, came in 1786 with something called Shays Rebellion. So here's the story. You got these farmers in Massachusetts, many of them guys who just fought in the war, and now they're drowning in debt and taxes, about to lose their land. So they do what they know how to do. They grab their guns and rise up. Massachusetts panicked and asked the national government for help, but there was no help to give. No money, no army. The state was on its own. And this was the moment everyone woke up. Shays Rebellion sent a shockwave through the country's leadership. It proved, in the most dramatic way possible, that their central government was so weak, it couldn't even keep the peace at home. The whole experiment was on the brink of failure. So after all of this, the gridlock, the economic mess, the shock of a rebellion, it became pretty clear to almost everyone that the Articles of Confederation were a disaster. Something had to change, and fast, or the whole country might just splinter apart. And part of the issue went even deeper. People didn't think of themselves as American first. They were a Virginian, or a New Yorker, or a Pennsylvanian. A weak national government only made that worse. The goal had to be to get people to start thinking of themselves as citizens of one nation. So let's just recap the final diagnosis, right? The central government was way too weak. The economy was a disaster. The nation couldn't defend itself. There was no real unity. The country was, quite literally, at risk of falling apart. The writing was on the wall. So what do? Well, the nation's leaders agreed they had to meet. The official plan was just to revise the Articles of Confederation. Just make a few tweaks. But a lot of them showed up in Philadelphia with a much bigger idea in mind. Scrap the whole thing and start from scratch. In the end, you can't say the Articles were a total failure. They were more like a really important first draft, a painful but absolutely necessary lesson in what not to do when you're building a government. They showed everyone exactly what a government needs: the power to tax, to regulate the economy, and to keep the peace. And this whole story leaves us with a huge question, one that we are still wrestling with today. How do you give a government enough power to actually be effective and solve problems without giving it so much power that it threatens the very liberty it's supposed to protect? That's the tightrope they tried to walk with the Constitution, and it's a balance we're still trying to get right.